Monster Hunter World is great, but there's no denying there's a lot to get to grips with. We've already covered some of these topics in a few videos like 7 tips for new hunters and 7 things that scare you about Monster Hunter World but shouldn't, but one of the things we haven't talked about yet is how to choose the right weapon for you. There are 14 different weapons to choose from in Monster Hunter World and each is very different, so to make things a bit simpler, here's a quick guide on how to pick the right one. We're going to start out with some basic tips and then we'll go through each of the weapons in turn so you know what to expect when you head off on a hunt. First up, if you've played Monster Hunter before, then you can relax. All the weapons in Monster Hunter World behave as you'd expect them to by now, and there are no new weapon types, so feel free to pick your old favourite and get stuck in. If, however, you're new to Monster Hunter, you might well be asking which is the best weapon. Well, the first step to finding it is to do away with the notion that there is a best weapon in the game. Each one is unique and they can all be upgraded to do some serious damage in the field, so you should focus instead on what's the best weapon for you. The chances are you'll already have an idea of the types of weapons you enjoy wielding in other games, so let that be your guide in the first instance. Do you like having a hefty weapon that dishes out loads of damage even though it slows you down? Or maybe mobility is key and you prefer being nimble enough to pour out a series of attacks punctuated by dodges, even if you're not taking off much of your enemy's health in any one hit. Once you've made up your mind in that area, you can start experimenting with the different weapons on offer in Monster Hunter World, but do bear in mind that certain weapons are more challenging for a beginner to pick up. The pipes may well be calling, for example, and who can blame you, the hunting horn is hilarious, but it's also quite tricky to get to grips with. When looking at the different weapons, you can see a star rating next to each one, which gives you an idea of its accessibility for new players. Pick a tricky one by all means, just be aware that getting to grips with it will likely take you a bit longer. As well as knowing broadly what type of weapon you prefer and which ones are going to be easier to pick up, the best advice I can give you is to start experimenting. You're given a basic version of each weapon for free at the start of the game, so try taking a few different ones out on quests and seeing which you click with. Don't forget there's also the training ground so you can get a feel for a weapon with no risk of fainting. Once you've done that, then you can start looking at upgrading your weapon without worrying about pouring crafting resources into something you won't be using in 2 quests time. Do your homework, in other words, before tearing your way through the upgrade tree. Right, and with those broad tips sorted, let's go through each of the weapons in turn and cover their strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to do this in the training area so you can see the combos on screen and get a feel for the types of moves you can pull off while you hear me prattle on. Apologies in advance if I'm rubbish with any of these weapons, by the way. Spoilers, I totally am. It's just that I've only used most of them once or twice as I settled on the charge blade fairly swiftly when I first started playing. Right, now that's out the way, let's go! So, first up, the sword and shield is pretty standard fare, offering a good balance between offense and defense without compromising your movement. In fact, it's pretty speedy and it has the added benefit of letting you use healing items with it still equipped, which is extremely useful in the middle of a pitched battle. On the other hand, the sword has a fairly short reach, which puts you at a slight disadvantage against bigger monsters, and its attacks don't do loads of damage, meaning you'll have to work a little bit harder to bring down your quarry. If being quick and nimble is really your thing though, you might want to consider the dual blades, which actually increase your movement speed. As you might expect, they don't do massive amounts of damage with each hit, but don't go dismissing them just yet. You can enter Demon Mode and unleash yet more attacks with boosted damage, and it also has the added benefit of looking pretty cool. Demon Mode is not without its drawbacks, however. Your stamina will drain while it's active, even if you're not, so staying in Demon Mode for too long and overexerting yourself can leave you exposed and vulnerable, which, of course, can lead to taking serious damage if you're not careful. Managing your stamina, in other words, is of paramount importance when using the dual blades, so you should try and learn quickly when to turn off Demon Mode and when it's safe to push yourself that little bit further. The next weapon is the light bowgun, which is, well, look at it. It's a gun. Now, being a ranged projectile weapon, there are no combos for you to worry about pulling off correctly. Instead, your main concern is in using the right ammo type at the right moment and aiming properly. There are lots of different ammo types for you to use in Monster Hunter World, each with its own status effect. These ammo types need to be crafted, which does give you an extra layer of management, but it's well worth the effort. Swapping between these in combat in order to be as effective as possible is the most important thing to bear in mind, and learning to do this swiftly and efficiently is the key to success when you're using the light bowgun. Aiming properly and ensuring you're at the right distance is also important, because you're not really going to do any meaningful damage if you're bloody miles away. There are two different firing modes for the light bowgun, one in which you shoot from the hip, and another that zooms in ever so slightly and brings up some crosshairs to allow for more precision in aiming. The light bowgun is easily one of the most accessible weapons in Monster Hunter World. It's easy to grasp, it's fun to use, and being a ranged weapon, it should keep you out of the worst of the danger while on the hunt. Emphasis on should. The Greatsword is up next. It's still rated pretty highly for beginners, but I think to say it's more of an intermediate weapon. It is, as you've probably guessed from this footage, a massive, slow, hitty thing. The Greatsword swings very slowly and also slows you down considerably while it's drawn, but makes up for this fact by dealing massive amounts of damage on every hit, especially the charged attacks, which will quickly become your best friend should you decide to wield one. The most important thing to bear in mind with the Greatsword is when to bother drawing the thing. While weapons like the dual blades allow you to charge about the place with relative impunity, the Greatsword is such a hefty piece of kit that it's really only worth drawing once you're in a position to hit something. In other words, slap a Greatsword across your back and you'll be capable of putting out huge amounts of damage. Just make sure your attacks are actually going to connect before you decide to draw the thing. Now the next intermediate weapon is the longsword, which is the yin to the Greatsword's yang. Where the Greatsword is a slow beast, the longsword is pretty swift, and, as the name suggests, it's got a pretty decent reach. The longsword has a spirit meter just below the stamina bar, which you can charge up by dishing out damage. Once you've got some charge in it, you can start doing spirit attacks, which do greater damage, so when wielding the longsword, it pays to take advantage of its swiftness and keep swinging so you can power yet more spirit attacks. The hammer is up next. It's a close-range weapon with more heft than your average hunter after a big meal in the canteen. As you can probably tell though, it has a pretty short range and is sometimes painfully slow to wield. If you can look past those shortcomings, however, you'll find a great friend in the hammer. Its charged attacks are unblockable, which is absolutely tremendous, and if you can land a few in a row, you'll knock your enemy out, setting you and your fellow hunters up to deal some serious damage. Of course, with the heft of the hammer and those sluggish swings, using it is a lot like wielding the Greatsword, which is to say you should make sure you're going to hit before you go in swinging. The gun lance is one of the more iconic Monster Hunter weapons, which is to say it's a bit of a harebrained scheme that somehow still manages to work. As you've probably guessed from the name, it's a lance that, doubles as a gun. Using the lance itself allows you to seek out your enemy's weak spots and give them a poke, while firing explosives allows you to add damage buffs to your attacks. Those offensive capabilities are pretty hard on the gun lance, however, meaning it'll go blunt a lot faster than other weapons. Knowing when to stop firing and when to drop out of the fight to dig out your whetstone are two important considerations when using the gun lance, keeping you in a position to deal out a decent amount of damage free from unfortunate hiccups. Avoid button mashing too freely with this weapon, and much the same as with the other heavy weapons in Monster Hunter World, make sure you're actually going to connect before going in for that final attack. The switch axe is another dual-purpose weapon on offer in Monster Hunter World, allowing you to switch between an axe and a honking great sword. The axe has range and heft on its side, while the sword swings with a pleasing speed and has the added benefit of files, allowing you to release stored energy and boost your attacks. This is basically the inverse of the charge blade, which we'll be looking at shortly. Chances are when using the switch axe you'll have a favourite mode, but you shouldn't rely too heavily on either. The sword simply isn't as effective without a charge, so switching to the axe every now and then is pretty important. Get a handle on when to do this and you'll be slaying monsters in no time at all. Very similar to the switch axe, meanwhile, is the charge blade, my personal favourite. The charge blade has two modes. Using it in sword mode charges the axe, allowing you to unleash the energy stored in the files in order to dish out extra damage. While using the sword mode, you also get the added benefit of having a shield, which is pretty handy for deflecting minor blows. Switching between the charge blade's two modes is very satisfying, but it can also be fairly slow, so getting a feel for the ebb and flow of your weapon and knowing when it's safe to make the change is the most important thing to bear in mind. Switching to axe mode really does allow you to beef up your damage stats though, so it's worth waiting until you have a full charge in order to really capitalise on the potential to cause harm once you've gone through the switch animation. The insect glaive is another one of Monster Hunter's more curious weapons. It comes in two parts: the glaive, which is a swift and fluid double-bladed staff, and the kinsect, which is a bug attached to your arm that you can fire at your enemies. When you send out a Kinsect, basically it can grab extracts from monsters and use those to provide handy buffs. The glaive itself, meanwhile, allows you to get creative with aerial maneuvers, flinging yourself into the air and churning out a good amount of damage. There's an awful lot going for the insect glaive, in other words, but it's not without its foibles. In fact, using it effectively can prove pretty tricky, especially for new players. Learning to aim the Kinsect launcher takes time, as does getting to grips with the aerial moves of the glaive itself. Knowing which bit of the monster to target in order to get the buff you want is also something it's important to bear in mind, so if you are tempted by this weapon, it's a good idea to put in a decent amount of practice before taking it on any serious hunts. Next up is the heavy bowgun, which in principle behaves a lot like the light bowgun, in that it's a ranged weapon that's great for applying lots of different status effects to monsters at a decent clip. This, by the way, is a practice called status gunning, which has earned the bowguns a bit of a reputation as support weapons, but in truth they're good enough to take on monsters solo, so don't be dissuaded if you're going to be spending a lot of time on the hunt by yourself. With ammo types, of course, comes the need to reload, and this is where you need to be cautious while using the heavy bowgun. Reloading can leave you vulnerable to attack, so pick your moment and your positioning carefully to keep the fight from suddenly going pear-shaped. The key things you're going to need to learn to become proficient with the heavy bowgun is, firstly, how to aim the thing, and then what the optimum range is. If you're too far away from your target, you'll be less effective and the fight will just get drawn out, or worse, end up in you fainting. The heavy bowgun requires a cool head and a steady hand, in other words, but the ability to apply so many status effects is a real bonus if you've got the patience to master it yourself. Acting as a useful middle ground between the light bowgun and its heftier counterpart, meanwhile, is the bow. The bow allows for some really nice fluid ranged attacks while keeping you out of harm's way, and, like the bowguns, it's really versatile in terms of applying different status effects to enemies as and when they're needed in combat. The main difference between the bow and the bowguns, however, is that it doesn't use ammo to do this. Instead, there are powder coatings which are applied to arrows for use on the hunt. As well as spamming out arrows at a fairly decent clip and boasting a couple of cool special attacks, the bow also allows you to charge your shots, although doing so will consume stamina, so, much like the dual blades, there's an element of stamina management involved in wielding this weapon effectively. Your main priority in getting to grips with the bow is learning how long it takes to charge a shot, and only charging when you're ready to fire. This will minimise the amount of time you spend holding the shot and expending energy, meaning you're less likely to exhaust yourself and be caught with your greaves around your ankles. There are just 2 weapons left in this little Monster Hunter Martial primer, and make no mistake, both of them can be considered advanced choices that will take time and dedication to master. The first one of these, thankfully, is bloody hilarious because it's the hunting horn. Apologies in advance for how ineptly I wield it in this footage, by the way, I'm just not very good with it at all. Anyway, the hunting horn is similar to the hammer in that you can biff monsters in the face hard enough to knock them out if you do it right, but it also has the added advantage of an increased range. Moreover, being a musical instrument, the horn can also be used to play different songs, with each one adding an additional buff to you and the members of your party. I played with somebody really proficient at using the horn a few days ago, and believe me, it made a big difference. There's also just something really funny about running around the place with a weapon that looks like a set of bagpipes on steroids, but sounds like a didgeridoo. As I mentioned, however, the hunting horn is an advanced weapon, and the main drawback is that it's really quite fiddly to use. The songs you learn are essentially combos, a series of button presses and attacks you need to pull off before you're eligible to hit R2, or the right trigger depending on your platform, and start rocking out with your buffs out. Learning and remembering these combos can be a challenge, so, like any musical instrument, if you want to play it well, you're going to have to be prepared to practice. And finally, we've already met its gunpowder packing brother, but the last weapon in this list is the lance. The lance boasts long range, a useful shield, and both high and low attacks, allowing you to seek out weak spots and dish out damage with great precision. It's not a weapon for the faint of heart, however, as your movement is seriously hampered when using it. This increases your reliance on the shield, but then, of course, using that to defend yourself requires stamina, meaning the lance is a bit of a stamina balancing act between getting damage out and having enough puff left to keep your health bar full. And there you have it, a quick glance at each of Monster Hunter World's weapons and a few tips on how to find the right one. Hopefully it helped. If you do have any particular tips to share about your favourite weapon, feel free to stick them in the comments below. We've got plenty of videos on Monster Hunter World, so if you haven't seen any of those, do give them a click. Do like and subscribe if you feel like it, but most importantly, thank you very much for watching, have a lovely day, and good hunting!